All right, good afternoon. My name is Will Moore, and I'm here with Erica Chenoweth and Christian Davenport. And we are got together on a call because in the wake of the Charleston shooting and the national response to the events surrounding that, I found myself really wanting to connect with some people to do some processing, to discuss my own thoughts and reactions, and frankly to learn from some. And I'm in a good position where I've got some great friends and colleagues who I know will have useful things to say. So if Erica, you could, I'm a professor at Arizona State University, and Erica, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure, Erica Chenoweth from the University of Denver.
And Christian?
Christian Davenport, professor at University of Michigan and research professor at Peace Research Institute, Oslo.
All right, so we have an informal discussion that we want to have, and so Erica, if I could turn it over to you to get us started.
Sure. So I think I'm just going to start by explaining why I was so eager to join the call with you, Will and Chris, and then maybe we can turn to a couple of the questions. About a year and a half ago, I was involved in a workshop in Nashville, Tennessee, with a number of North American activists, and it was right after Ferguson happened. And so I was with a large number of extremely talented and informed people when that started to happen, and when the response started to really pick up at the community level as well. And I remember I was eating dinner, and I'd been talking a little bit at this workshop about things like nonviolent direct action and repressive environments, nonviolent action and the emergence of violent flanks, and different topics of that nature. And at dinner, one of my colleagues who was there, who herself works with youth in Chicago and social mobilization there, came and asked me why it was that I hadn't said anything about Ferguson. And my response was, well, honestly, I think that it's time for Black voices and voices of color to be elevated and raised, because it's sort of enough of white people getting to talk about these types of topics, and I feel like if I weigh in, that it's going to distract from the people who are actually doing the hard work on the ground and who are taking control of this environment and pushing things forward. And so I feel like I'm not qualified, nor ought I engage in conversation related to this. And she said, you know what, I'm a Black grandmother. I have 7 grandchildren, and I live my entire life in terror that one of them will not make it home alive from school. And when these types of things happen, I'm so full of mourning and terror and frustration and sadness, and it's a lived experience that I have every day of my life. And when that's going on for me, the silence of white people like you is deafening to me. And so I think that the main reason I'm here on this call and why I'm hoping to continue this conversation for a long time and with lots of other people is because I want to learn how to not be silent and to be productive, and to at the same time maintain the position that I ought to have, you know, in this type of social conversation. That is not step on any toes, but also, you know, be fully empowered to engage in a productive conversation. So just with that introduction, I'll just say that, you know, the thing that struck me the most in the wake of the Charleston shooting, but really all of the different violence that Black people have been experiencing in our country lately, has been, you know, people's kind of conversation about what to call it. And, you know, I know a lot of people who call this basically state-sanctioned lynchings when it happens at the hands of police. And I know people who call the Charleston one a terror attack or a hate crime because it was not state-sanctioned, technically. But what really interests me about this incident and the sort of literature that political scientists can bring to bear on it is the politics of polarization, and how the way that I grew up affects the way I see this event. And in fact, the more we sort of talk ourselves into our comfortable prior beliefs about it, the less we can communicate with one another about it. So like, there's going to be a certain proportion of people who don't want to call it a hate crime, don't want to call it a terror attack. And in fact, it's kind of impossible to reason in this type of environment with people, it seems. So that raises a host of questions for us as a society about how to actually engage in this conversation in productive ways, rather than people kind of sorting themselves into self-selected echo chambers, so to speak. So that's one thing I'm interested in talking about.
Damn.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I have to confess, I get frustrated pretty quickly, and part of wanting to get on, get in touch with you guys and talk was to see if I could, find some way out of that frustration. I guess I have a little bit of a pessimistic nature anyway, and I can quickly spin pessimistic stories about this, about this kind of thing, and so one of them would be this echo chambers kind of problem, and and white silence. Connecting back to what you were saying before, it's odd. One of the things I try to do when I started using Facebook is to just put out information. I know that we've all seen the various studies of what does a white person's network look like, and I know what my social network looks like both virtual and not virtual is it's a white network, and so I remember seeking out a couple of different websites that reported on Black life and just starting to try to push that kind of information out there. And in particular, what I focused on was police violence, having no idea that it was going to, over the next 18 months, by which I mean particularly killings, but just basically black, abuse of black folks, which is of course something I've known about for decades. But it's somehow hidden to white folks, even though if you pay attention, you can see it, and trying to just put that out there. But I've wondered, how many people have clicked off particularly once it started to become an issue, and then we had Ferguson, and how many people have filtered, who I'm trying to sort of expose to this. And I don't know what the answer is. I assume it's quite a few. And it's interesting that, the story you tell, to call out and name it and draw attention to it is something I feel I can participate in. I've blogged about it. I've expressed my anger and frustration over events, and I've also tried to post works that people could read to try to learn more about it and talk about that kind of stuff. But that's calling attention to it is one thing, and I feel like we've reached a point where, at least for this moment, for this summer, we have some attention to it. And the Black Lives Matter, Dream Defenders, there's a variety of organizations that have played a big role in that. Social media has played a big role in that. But how do we stop the sectoring off into self-selected listening, and I can think about this in my own family. How do I talk to my brother about it, which I have not done? How do I talk to my father about it, which I have not done? Who are both people who are not, they're likely to quite quickly turn off because that just sounds unpleasant to them and they don't want to go there.
Mm-hmm. What I find interesting is there's no way I would have initiated this call, in part because it's like, I think some people, they're just like tired of hearing it, right? I remembered some senior black scholar told me once, he said, you know, U.S. people in the U.S. don't like complainers. They like winners. And so in line with that, but there's also this weird connection to victories for social justice that we like, but that gets back to the winner thing. So it's like, I don't know how you get past we're victimized, we're having trouble, and now we've won. I mean, how you get there? Because it's like, if you complain too much, then you don't want to hear it. Do either of you remember it started under Clinton. It was like a conversation on like racial injustice or racial harmony. If you read the transcripts on these things, they're amazing, right? Because it starts off that the local panel talks about racism in general, and I think it was John Hope Franklin makes a comment about kind of like generally what was going on, what they were trying to do, and then at a certain point they opened it up to like the local folks, and they gave them a mic, and I remember that each time they gave the mic to the people, invariably that's when things went like really bad, because basically they gave like a 78-year-old guy a minute and a half to talk about his experience in racism, and so that for me was like the epitome of like this ultimate example of, yes, America, you have a minute and a half to talk about your trouble, but then get on with it. And so it was this weird thing where it's like, I rarely see a space for having this conversation. Just one more thing, I just spent some time with some friends of mine, and we met through this conversation on racial harmony in Houston, Texas, when I was there, and we still stayed in contact. The thing was really
about... back in the 90s.
This is back in like 94, 95. There was an artistic exhibition, and my mom wasn't able to show up, and she had a painting of a black Christ being painted guiltily by two white people looking at the audience, but it was basically everyone brought their work forward, and so all the people were there talking about kind of like race and racism, and the art was the focus to get us there. And it quickly changed to be like, hey, we have this space, let's keep it open and let's just talk about stuff. And it was weird because we ended up staying for almost a year, once a month, for like a whole like Sunday, like 4 or 5 hours, where we just talk about race and racism. And some of it was all very moving, but it was interesting. Some just kind of came to one event, and some came to kind of let's talk about some systemic stuff, and some got used to the group, and some didn't, and some were frustrated by it. But the conversation, I mean, I came out with these amazing friends, but it was this part of the rarity was this space to actually have a conversation about what we were perceiving and all this other business, and I guess you have to be in the right space to have that. But I'm glad we had this space. So.
Well, Eric, I don't know if you would agree with this, if this matches at all with your experience, but my experience is that people of color don't seem to have trouble having conversations about race, and at least that's been my experience. Talk about trying to have that conversation with other white folks. It's remarkable how little success I'll have. I mean, it quickly either goes to platitudes such as, "Oh, we're all opposed to racism," right? Or people, start doing some version of, "Well, not all," which now we can at least roll our eyes because of that Twitter, the various Twitter not alls, which is wonderful. But that's when there isn't a person of color in the room, right? I'm talking about my experience with when you bring someone into the room and the white people just get quiet. They won't say anything. There is no conversation. And so I guess where my major frustration is I feel like white people in the United States have a major problem. We're not interested in facing it. We're not interested in discussing it. And, I sort of I have this, that image of the ostrich putting its head in the sand.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not putting my head in the sand at the racist violence or the other issues. I'm putting my head in the sand to try and have a conversation with people like me, who frankly are, the people I know. So I can think of some long-term. I'd be happy to discuss that. But man, if you want to start saying, well, what do we do today? What do we do this week? What do we do now? How, there's this great line in, it's a book about this, and I was actually prompted to think about it from, I don't have the comments up in front of me, but one of the comments that someone had asked on Facebook on your post saying, are there other societies and examples? And this guy Donald Woods, who was an editor for a South African newspaper, who became friends with Stephen Biko and ended up, as a consequence, having to leave the country. And there's a movie about it in the book, and Biko's under a banning order. Who, for those who don't know, was the face of the Black Power movement in South Africa in the mid-1970s. And he's under a banning order, which means he can't meet with or speak to more than one person at a time, and he can't speak to the press. And so his wife is really upset about his plan to meet with this white editor of a British heritage South African newspaper. And she says to him, "Stephen, is this worth it?" And he looks at her and says, "For the education of a white liberal, yes, this is worth it." You know, and it's one of these sort of things where even in our discipline, you look at political scientists, I just don't feel like my colleagues get it. I don't. They don't see what I can see, and I'm bad at sharing it with them, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think we've done, you know, as an industry, if you want to call academia an industry, you know, diversity training and inclusion means CYA training and staying out of trouble and, you know, basically eliminating or minimizing liability. And that's true with a lot of different types of kind of moral and ethical behaviors that we have at the university. I mean, ethics training means how to get through IRB and get your research done.
Yep.
It doesn't mean, should you do the research? What are the implications for people? Who's vulnerable as a result of you doing this research? Who wins and who loses, right? Like we just don't have those types of conversations. They aren't part of our training. And so, you know, I think that part of it's just that we've, you know, as institutions and bureaucracies, our institutions water down these types of really important conversations, or, you know, they basically relegate them to the fringes of campus where these types of conversations do go on, but they're going on, you know, among people with much more kind of race consciousness and whatever. And so I think that for myself, I agree with you. It actually reminded me so much of King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he, you know, he's basically saying, I don't mind as much the people who are overtly racist. I mean, I mind them, but the people that drive me nuts are the white moderates, right? Because they're the ones that keep looking at me, and they're supposed to be on my side, but they keep telling us to go slow and let the system sort it out and to work through the institutions, and that's why we live in a democracy. And their blindness to the fact that the democracy doesn't work the same, you know, for people of color is what makes me crazy. And so I think, you know, it's not a new thing that, you know, it's kind of a white people's problem, and that those are the most difficult conversations to have because, you know, white liberals are self-deceived. And self-deceit is much more difficult to overcome than
I mean, clearly there's some black people that are, you know, also not seeing it as well. No, I mean, and I think it would be useful to maintain.
However, they're not as big
conversations. No, I mean, I wouldn't even go that far, right? Because there's some variation in the response. But that said, I think part of the difficulty folks might have is that book Carol Mueller wrote called Compassion Fatigue, and she argued that part of the difficulty with actually getting people to kind of engage with discussing a problem was the lack of an ability to actually understand how you could fix it. So it's just like, we really couldn't handle Rwandan violence because we didn't know what to do with that. But once there was a refugee camp set up, or thousands of them, we were just like, you send money to refugee camps. There's something that I can do now.
Yeah.
So like on this problem, it's kind of like, what do you do? I mean, that's why I was kind of like, how do we come up with cameras on cops? And I'm just like, you know what? Someone came up with an idea that could fix it, and then people got behind it. Or 24-hour basketball. Remember when that came out as a solution to, like, you know,
right.
How do we deal with crime in the inner city? create some 24-hour basketball courts. That'll stop them. I mean, like, you know, so it's like, I think literally we're searching for answers for stuff, and the minute any answer comes up, it might be like you might be ready to run with it. And maybe part of what our conversation is able to do is come up with like mini answers and mini responses to kind of like progress and move things along so people aren't completely lost as to figure out what to do. Maybe a conversation in and of itself is a start, right? Yeah.
I mean,
I think so, and I think that people who have their minds changed are the most powerful kind of spokespeople to sort of mobilize and inspire others to get involved. So, you know, we know that converts are often the most effective converters, right? And the reason is because they're able to persuade from their own point of view. And, you know, all kinds of kind of cognitive and social psychological research suggests that if you can start a conversation by telling somebody that you used to think just like they did, and to sort of meet them where they're at, and then walk them through the transformation you had, it's much more powerful than just kind of assaulting them with information that violates their prior beliefs. And I was asking Steve Pinker once about this, about whether people get angry with him when he talks about violence declining, and he said, oh yeah, people get like really angry about it, and they're like verbally attacking me and everything, and he said, and there's this great research by this guy Jonathan Haidt, you both probably know about him, and he talks about how, you know, when people are confronted with information that conflicts with their prior beliefs, their brains actually emit, you know, like the same hormone that it emits if you get punched in the face. So it's like actually you feel like really defensive and angry, and so if you can start without violating the prior beliefs but meeting the prior beliefs and then moving people through, then it's a much more powerful form of persuasion. And so that's why I think conversations are so powerful.
There's another side of it too that is if we when you hear about something that leads you to maybe have some culpability or some guilt, right? That's another reason to react negatively and shut down, right? So it seems like we've identified three different things. One, that just natural reaction to having your prior beliefs violated. Two, that if you're not handing me a solution, I don't even want to hear about it. And three, wait a minute, doesn't that mean I'm culpable somehow? And that's interesting. I mean, I know my own experience is I've gone out of my way at various times where something's been handed to me at various moments in my life where I've gotten some information about the history of the United States that I just had never been given before, right? And it was completely inconsistent with what my experience had been or what I had learned elsewhere, and so that's one thing that we can do is try to offer some people that are interested, what might I read or see or engage, the implicit racism site. Erica, you talked about a video that had an impact on you, and I can put down some books, and maybe we can draft a blog post. I think all three of us have blogs, so we could do that.
Although doing it with a mindset to avoiding the hate principle seems like that's going to be a little bit difficult, right? I mean, my thing was like for the longest time, I was kind of like, all right. The minute I realized that there was I think Will's heard me talk about this. The minute I heard there was a slave census, there was a record on 4 million people of African descent, 4 million enslaved by plantation, their age, their race, black or mulatto. I'm like, the minute I heard about this, and like, were they categorized as insane? Did they try to escape? I was like, okay, the black people don't have names, but all the slave owners do. So the Ben Affleck thing. So I was kind of like, okay, I should just put all this information out there. But then you're just kind of like, all right, so then by definition, if someone's name happens to be the same name, then okay, you're calling them out. So there's this balance between like the identification of accurate historical information and calling people out and stopping them from doing or saying anything on your behalf. And so I've been caught because I've been like, a lot of what we do is catalog events and catalog evil and catalog horrors, to put that out there to kind of move a conversation. But with this hate argument, it's kind of like, it's really awkward, right? You could put the information out there, but then that's just going to have the complete opposite effect of what you'd like it to have, which is to kind of move people together. The minute people are confronted with this information, they might move in the other direction. So it's like, oh, wow. Not that we should stop collecting it, but I'm just kind of going, it doesn't have that cathartic. I mean, a lot of the whole civil rights movement was, if people just knew how bad things were for black folk, then, I mean, this part didn't work out right. If people just knew, if they saw, then everything could be, you know, then we'd have an immediate kind of like cross-generational, cross-race cooperation, and we'd end this problem. It's like, not everybody. And so I always get caught on what to do with that, because there's the cataloger in me, which is like, let's catalog horrible events, let's pull them together. Let's see if we can get identification of every activity that police are engaging in, all black on black crime. But then I'm like, okay, so let's say we have the most accurate database on police versus civilian violence in the United States. A bunch of people are not going to be happy about seeing this at all, because they'll be like, they're out there protecting our lives. So what? Some bad things happened every now and then. We're not changing them, and it's just like, I'm like, hold it. Don't you see this data? And they're like, no. And so it's like, data will not resolve all problems. So for me, that kind of always messed me up, because I'm just like, you can't have a conversation with facts and history. It's like, there needs to be some other way to get to it. So while we can compile a list, I'm wondering if in and of itself, because like as Erica was talking about the film last time, I thought of this movie, of course I can't think of the name right now, Suture. And the whole movie, there's a black, this won't destroy it too much, but there's a black character there's a black character who, when they're described, everyone says they're white. But the whole movie, you're looking at him going, but he's black, what's wrong with him? And then you realize at the end of the movie, you were the problem. You just couldn't roll with it. You were just like, he's like, but he's black, what's wrong with him? And then you realize the whole film was about making you go, why were you hung up on race the whole film? And I'm like going, damn, got me. But similarly, you know, we can put this information out there, but then the people's perceptions of it and whether or not we're calling them on it, we're preaching to the choir. It's an interesting issue to try to figure out who best to start a conversation with. And
yeah, I mean, I think it speaks a little bit to people's different modes of learning, and how people do come to empathize and understand things that they can't get through the rational part of their brain. And you know, for me, the reason that the film, documentary, The Color of Fear, was so powerful is because it didn't appeal to the rational part of my brain. It appealed to other parts, and you know, actually much more just my sense of morality and everything. So so that was important, and you know, I think novels and film and music and all of these things are so useful for that reason. And I think, you know, Christian, when you were talking, I was thinking about your research and especially the recent research that you've done on how survey respondents react to images of white and black police and protesters, respectively, in assigning blame attribution to the different actors. So just for, if anybody happens to be watching this conversation, Christian has a working paper out there with Rose McDermott, and is it Jonathan Piston? Is that his name?
No, Dave Armstrong, actually. Yeah.
Oh, Dave Armstrong. Okay. And what they do is they have an experiment where they provide survey respondents with different scenarios, and what they do is they change the racial composition of police and protesters. And in scenarios where police are white and protesters are black, or in scenarios where, say, police are white but protesters are of mixed race, one of the key findings that comes out is that white respondents have a much more complicated response to the scenarios where the protesters have mixed race. And I think that speaks so much to precisely why white allyship is something worth pursuing, because the way that white people change their mind is by white people showing them, through their own behavior and action, what they ought to be thinking and doing and feeling. And it's just one of those sort of tragic realities of subconscious race bias, that when there were white police and there were just black protesters, that white respondents were much more likely to attribute blame to the protesters. Whereas black respondents were much more likely to attribute blame to the police, no matter what the race of the protesters was. And so, it speaks to our own position in society and what our life experience has brought to us. But I think that it's so powerful in demonstrating the way that white people, informing themselves and starting to participate in ways that support movements like Black Lives Matter, can be really powerful, and actually in a way why it's so critical that occurs. Mm-hmm. And then, the question comes up, okay, how do you participate without taking over or co-opting, which is my big concern for myself. And I recently thought a lot about just like, how would you behave if somebody invited you into their home? Like, would you go in there and tell them to move the furniture around and change the wallpaper and like put on different music? No, you would just have some basic manners and respect and stay out of the way and actually offer to help and do whatever you can to help around the place, but not tell them what to do, right? So I think just common sense can sort of guide the rules of engagement in that way.
But I want to push that a little bit in that the concept of allyship is a good one, but it's also limiting it, I think, in an important way. I'm completely blanking on the Daily Show correspondent's name, which is frustrating me, but there was a bit this past week about that, where making that point about, well, white people only hear white people, right? And so the whole bit was that when Jon Stewart would say it, the white guy was, oh, I get it, but when the senior black correspondent, whose name I can't think of, said it, the dude's like, wait, what? No.
Which in and of itself proves the point, but that was funny.
Right? And so if it's, what I'm wondering about is, can we get, it's just insane to think, how do we get a transformation where white people take responsibility for their fellow white people, right? Because if, under the allyship model, black folks are responsible for changing white folks' mind. I mean, black folks are responsible for sharing their experience and that, but, is there a way to try to make more white folks see eradication is way too strong. Limiting, reducing racial inequalities a part of what they're going to take on and work on, rather than just being an ally of a civil rights movement.
But that gets to some kind of internal policing, right? And that presumes that there's no white divisions that matter significantly, right? I mean, you introduce like white class differences. I mean, you spend some time on like Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, you'll see some real big differences from some folks living in like Roxbury, right? So it's like there's a presumption that there's some kind of connection there. I remember living in like hanging out in Golden outside of Denver and working in Boulder. I mean, very different white folk in those three areas alone, let alone thinking about if they interacted. So I think there's some level of presumed civil society and communication so that internal policing would be even possible that makes some of these things really difficult, right? So it's like, who could blacks ally with? Who could whites monitor? Who would whites interact with? And this gets to be, I mean, I remember people there was some public opinion poll that came out that I think the rest of the state of Colorado really didn't particularly care for Denver or Boulder. I mean, so given that, there's no conversation that's going to be happening between the different Colorado Springs or, what, not to pick on them, but that became kind of interesting to think about how our sense of community is hindering our ability to politically mobilize because it's caught within these structures and divisions. Yeah.
I actually think this is a huge tragedy of democracy as well, which is that on the one hand you have these kind of institutions that semi-function and do reasonably well at macro conflict resolution, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. At least they manage the conflict in some way, but they're not good enough, right? And they're not fair for everyone, and they can be easily kind of taken over and controlled by a single group. Mm. But then what happens is the people living in the country think, well, I get to vote and I get to sue and I get to do all these other kind of legal channels and institutional channels for resolving my conflicts. And so, you can only mobilize for like 2 years at a time, and then everybody goes into the next election cycle, and it's like they're all just pushing to get, the next person that they don't want of office, that they're trying to vote for the other guy. And so that's where all the mobilization energy goes into. And then, between elections, people generally stick to a single issue. And we haven't seen a lot of these kind of movement moments until maybe now, where you do see, the various different social movement organizations kind of uniting under one kind of key issue. But, I mean, there's even kind of like climate change organizing, and then there's Black Lives Matter organizing. Those are maybe the big two movements right now in this country. There's maybe the third largest is economic inequality, and then we also have, a variety of other less progressive social movements as well. And so, we have them all at the same time, and it's like getting all that energy to focus into a single kind of common point is the tragedy of democracy. In fact, it's so funny, in some of our research on nonviolent mass movements, it's almost like way easier for them to form and focus in authoritarian regimes because they can personify the enemy, and in democracies they can't.
Yeah, there's a focal point, right?
Yeah, I guess which would be one of the reasons for doing it.
Right.
Yeah, I wonder. Oh, sorry, Will.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that there's this interesting element because it was one of these posters I saw something. It was just like, it was the transition that I was expecting to happen at some point. It was all lives matter, and I'm just like, and I was wondering how long the Black Lives Matter moment would persist in this democratic poll, right? Because it'd be like, well, what about so and so's lives? And I'm like, yeah, everyone's life matters, but I'm like, there's probably risk propensities across groups, and so the minute you try to like break it down immediately, right? So I'm just like, we're not saying that all lives don't matter, but
for sure we all agree on that, right?
But it's interesting, right? Because like it goes back to Erica's point. It was like there's a certain window you have to talk about your problems, and you better communicate that really well because then we're going to move on. Because I know the minute you start talking about black problems, then normally be like, well, I mean, on my Facebook page, someone made some remark. I think I was talking about like anti-black violence against the police, and someone was just like, "Well, other people are killed by the police too." And I'm just like, "Yeah, I have no problem with that. I mean, like, and we're talking about that too, and we should talk about all of them." And then they made some comment regarding, black people weren't the only people that like got treated poorly in history. There was Japanese internment, and I'm just like, really? We're going to compare Japanese internment to slavery now? And I'm just like, and I realized, you know what? Yes, this is that moment. And so I laid out, I'm like, well, slavery lasted for this long, and Japanese internment lasted for that long, and this many people were involved in this, and this many people were, and I'm like, what? We actually haven't really had those conversations. And it's weird because it gets back to that kind of universalist point. We're just like, well, everyone suffered a little bit. And I'm kind of like, it's like what the South African Truth and Reconciliation effort tried to do. Well, we all suffered, and they ignored the data, which was just like, well, actually, the government kind of persecuted this group a little bit more than everybody else. And so this gets back to the kind of factually it might look like this, but the stories that'll motivate and lead people to reconciliation and peace might look like that, and we might need to adjudicate and choose between them. But it seems like it's this interesting battle that we need to choose about how we label a thing. Because like the label thing has really bothered me. I'm just like, well, why isn't it terrorism and racism and a hate crime and genocide. I'm like, why isn't it all these things? Why it has to be one thing? And maybe the one thing is this, that's how people could communicate or understand it best, if it's pitched as one thing. And so it's the simplification narrative. I mean, Will and I had this thing where we talked about media tropes and stuff, and there's this homogenizing and simplifying element that kind of comes through mass discussions within democracies in general, but maybe all societies. And that's kind of, I find much of the things that we're grappling with, that kind of fight against that simplification narrative and effort.
Mm-hmm.
But at a political risk. I mean,
yeah.
That's going back to Erica's observation, right? I mean, to the extent that single issue dominates, and you get one label you can put on it
for a certain amount of time,
right? And so that I think is a trade-off that politicians excel at. That's what allows them to be politicians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Shoot.
I was going to just strike off in a completely different direction. I'm curious about your reactions. Brian Phillips has got, I think it's a forthcoming paper, and he's talked about it at the blog we're all a part of, Political Violence at a Glance, and so hopefully you guys have seen it. And he makes an interesting argument that the reason that we see lone wolf attacks here in the United States is because the FBI is so good at what it does, that though we get to local police and state level police and all that, it's a different story, but at the FBI level, they have been for decades paying attention to white supremacy and other hate groups. And we all know what they did in COINTELPRO, and that I suspect you guys are probably like me and think that probably much of those same sorts of infiltration and penetration and kinds of things are going on. And his argument is that you're not going to see many large group attacks when you have that level of policing. And it raises all sorts of interesting conundrums. I have been surprised at going from 1990 through 2050 as we watch white Americans shift from being a dominant majority to being, a slight minority versus all other racial or ethnic groups. I fully expect, and you add on to it the failure of white males who only get a high school education to do well in the job market, and economic fluctuations and stuff. I've expected many more of these crimes than we've actually seen, frankly. And I think, we know the groups are out there and they're mobilized. You can go visit their websites, and you can see the billboards they put up if you live down here in the South like I do. But one of the things the FBI came out with, as you guys know, is that a concern about these sorts of groups penetrating police organizations at the local level, and we've certainly seen in San Francisco and in many other cities, in Cleveland, and I can't even rattle them all off, where in Ferguson, where information has come out about private communication, that emails and tweets and texts and that people were doing, cops were doing with one another, more than happy to talk, to share their racist views. And so I guess that really wasn't, try and focus this a little bit. At one level, terror attacks, the right thing to do in a terror attack is to ignore it. Is to just keep on keeping on, is to not do what George Bush did in response, and fire up the troops and go invade a country and all that sort of a thing. And so as we see these sorts of attacks, is it, should we be encouraging, a police response? Are we happy with what the FBI is doing? Is this work by Phillips saying, yeah, that's actually going to keep it down less than it otherwise would be? Do your civil rights issues come up if we know what what the FBI tends to do when it's penetrating organizations. What thoughts, if any, do you guys have on that?
So, Chris, why don't you say what you think first? I have some thoughts that are still coalescing.
I'm caught, right? So the minute it happens, I start thinking of the hate crimes data that people are collecting, which is mostly, if you look at proportional, it's mostly anti-black activity, right? Just got a new label. And
Yeah.
so I've been caught lately by the disaggregation of racism, right? So you have hate crimes, you have protesting while black, you have driving while black. There's some research on walking while black. I'm just like going, okay, so let's put them all together. And so there's a part of me that's...
Muslim is starting to compete, right?
Yes.
Arab/Muslim identity in the U.S. is,
Yeah.
it's a whole different history, but...
Yeah, exactly. And so my thing is, like, there's a part of me that's kind of like, you know what? We need to be talking about moratoria on sentencing. We need to be talking, it's a broader conversation of, we need to bring all these isolated events and bring them together, because I think the sheer largesse of it, I mean, like, when I saw the movie The Hurricane, I didn't think of Denzel's performance. I didn't think of even that individual. I'm just like, if this is one case out of all the cases in New Jersey, why are any black people at all in prison? So literally, I think we need to kind of start adding these events together. And when we start putting these things together, then it starts to tell us something. There was something else I thought in what you said with regards to kind of like, you expected more attacks. And I'm just like, all right, I'm like, there's a decent number of the hate crimes thing that goes on. But then I wonder if maybe one of the successes of the civil rights movement was just like the federal government of the United States was just like, okay, you can have whatever problems you want to with black people, but it can involve bloodshed. Do whatever you want to them, but just don't kill them. And so maybe that was a collective thing that we kind of came up to, because a lot of, like David Cunningham, the sociologist, research shows that the FBI guided white racist organizations and destroyed black radical ones. But they guided ones. They said, just don't engage in violence. You don't have to live with them. You have to go to school with them. You don't have to have jobs with them. Just don't kill them. And so that seemed to be kind of like this interesting dynamic you had about how some of the violence kind of might have calmed down. But maybe some of the violence calmed down because whites and blacks are so segregated in the society right now. It's just like maybe there was that integrationist moment where we were trying to jam them together. And guess what? It led to awful lot of violence. And part of the response was, we'll go this way, you go that way. We'll put Martin Luther King Street in the middle. And never the twain shall basically meet. And maybe that's one of the things that accounted for some of the reduced group organized violence that you were expecting more of. And this other type of violence, smaller scale, in community, because like black on black violence is just like skyrocketing as the impoverishment kind of kicks off. And I'm wondering if with the white impoverishment, is there a white on white violence phenomena, right? I mean, like, you don't hear people talk about it, but I presume if you have the degrees of unemployment and joblessness that you have, and then drugs and so forth, that's probably exploding there too. And so I'm wondering about that kind of phenomena that leads to the parsing and the reduction. We all expect there to be more, but there isn't. Kind of like, why isn't it happening? So those are the first things that came to me. But Erica, you were pausing for a second.
Yeah. So I think that that terror attacks tend to occur, lone wolf or not, in the context of contentious moments. And when you have a national crisis or you have mass protests, generally, and this is true in pretty much every country, there's some fringe that starts using violence. And the violence actually often comes from the opposing side first. That opposing side could be the state, or it could be a communal group that feels threatened, and that it's going to lose its privilege as a result of the mobilization. And I mean, whether you're talking about Italian kind of terror attacks during the 1970s and 80s, that the summer of '68 and the subsequent mobilization on the Italian left through '68 and '69 produced a huge backlash from right-wing extremist groups that started blowing stuff up and killing people. And then that's when you saw like the Red Brigades and a variety of other left-wing terror organizations emerge. And in fact, they literally called it, the right-wing groups literally called it the strategy of tension. And the idea was to pull the political, like to basically pull more weight than they could just by launching a counter-mobilization nonviolently, by using the violence and like balancing out the political impacts that the left could have through its nonviolent mobilization. And so, you know, for me, I think when I see these types of processes, I just think that it looks like a very familiar story from countless other cases, and that, you know, this is part of what happens when there are these big contentious moments. And so the question then is, like, who's responsible for preventing them? Well, if there's going to be a big contentious moment within a state, then one would expect that the sovereign government would be protecting the people who are behaving nonviolently from this type of violence, right? And, you know, ultimately, so long as we live in states, they're the ones that are responsible for providing the security. And so, you know, you can think about white supremacist terror as a failure, you know, of the government to provide its basic public service to the population that it's supposed to be protecting. But, you know, it's also, I think of, you know, you could think about it too as just like, the more organized it becomes among various different groups that feel that their privilege is threatened, the more dangerous it becomes. So lone wolves, you know, in terms of lethality, lone wolves are, it's more optimal to face them than to face organized groups any day of the week. So if you're going to have, like, you know, infiltration, scattering, and fragmenting these groups, then, you know, from the standpoint of a society facing them, it's highly preferable to have them scattered and fragmented rather than unified in a single entity. So,
well, and you know, and you think about this, you know, the perpetrator of the recent attack, he had a much less sophisticated version of, you know, of what you described, and these are attacks that, you know, one of the things about the terror tactic is you cannot defend against it. I mean, you can't defend all targets. I mean, you know, you can't even begin to think about trying to defend all targets. And I guess, you know, the part of what I meant by the optimal response is to ignore it as, yes, this is going to happen, this is expected, what he wanted to do with that attack, or presumably the one, you know, that couple in Las Vegas, or back to Charlie Manson, or you pick any of these people that are trying to kick off tensions by committing one of these attacks, they're, you know, we all know violence is polarizing, right? Back to one of the original comments you made at the top, Erica, and that's why ignoring it is appropriate. I mean, ignoring it it's not a good, it's a lousy phrase to use. I shouldn't have used it. To recognize it, I mean, and certain, but to accept it as part of what happens, and then you're saying, well, wait, I'm supposed to accept the violence and the, you know, how does that, isn't that in conflict with Black Lives Matter? And you can see how I'm struggling with, you know, with language here, but to have a, you know, to point out the state failure. On the other side of it, you know, does that mean that we're, you know, it's interesting to me, the limited narrative that I have seen, maybe it's out there, but the limited narrative I have seen about the intelligence failure to find this kid, right? I haven't seen that conversation. We know if that kid had been an ISIS supporter,
oh, yeah,
it would all be about the intelligence failure. You know, and yeah, he was putting his stuff out there and talking to people, and if, you know, he could have been found, just like any of these things we always know in retrospect you could find it, but I am not in favor of the NSA or the FBI monitoring and collecting everybody, you know, which is, you know, I mean, and no one's brought that up. Hey, you know, why didn't the NSA see this guy coming, et cetera, et cetera? And I think one of Phillips's arguments is that, well, they're good at seeing groups, but they're never going to be good at seeing these sort of lone perpetrators. But as you point out, something that very few people know, we're a non-trivial percentage probably of those who do, that that's exactly right. You get these contentious moments, you're going to get counter-mobilization. Is there anything that might be done to minimize it? And do we just turn it to the state? Here's a better question maybe. Is it something that groups that want to push for improving the civil rights and the status of people of color in the United States should, as we think about tactics and so forth for advancing that agenda, should we be thinking about counter-mobilization, and particularly counter-mobilization on violence? My gut reaction is no. That's not our job. That's not our responsibility. And the observation that kind of counter-mobilization is part and parcel to it seems consistent with my visceral no. What do you guys think?
What's interesting is in my How Social Movements Die book, my group, the Republic of New Africa, there's this incident that takes place in a black church, which basically was fascinating from my perspective in the sense that people who were not for this black secessionist, black nationalist organization beforehand, they had a meeting in a black church, and once they were attacked in the black church and their interaction with the police, everyone rallied to them in a way that was just like, there's this sacred ground argument. Attack. I mean, I think the whole conversation would be different had they been attacked. Had there been an attack in an NAACP office, or had there been an attack in some others? Yeah, exactly. And so, but what's interesting is the protection of black churches narrative that has emerged over time. There's been this kind of counter-mobilization, this militarized counter-mobilization from the black community. They've been trying to protect black churches, and that's been intricately connected with even the civil rights movement historically. So there might be that element of the policing. And I don't know if either one of you ever gone to like a Nation of Islam event, but everyone gets patted down going in. So it's like, this is, and it's unfortunate, but this type of incident is exactly the type of thing that favors that type of organizational setting, and to get people to be like, well, this never would have happened in a meeting with the nation. I mean, and so there's that element that gets transformed. That said, I mean, there's a broader context where, I mean, we're not at the Panther moment where black folk are going to be walking around openly armed, protecting themselves from white folks, because this happened in a particular setting. This is a very isolated individual. He did not have a clear connection with a bunch of other organizations. So I think this reemphasizes this. I think of the Norway moment, where that individual had come and shot these youth on the island. But what I found always shocking about that experience was how kind of like the country responded to it. I mean, it was an embracing. It was kind of like, rather than ignore it, as you were suggesting, I think what people are doing is they're embracing this conflict, because we can all agree that attacking a church is wrong. Right. And so Black Lives Matter, they matter more within the context of a black church. And so we can all identify them as people as faith, as people that were engaged in peacemaking, as people that, I mean, there's all these things that kind of come with that attack in that location. So I think rather than being polarizing, it's going to be used in the way that it is. The thing that scared me, though, is if you go back to the hate crimes data and you look at where all these different attacks are taking place, I'm like, none of them got as much press as this one did. And so now it's an interesting kind of dynamic of, okay, well, we need to address that variation and try to figure out, okay, why are black people seemingly under attack? And I saw some report someplace about hate crimes since Obama has been not only in office, but like a front runner. I mean, evidently the hate crimes were at a certain level, and then with Obama being introduced, that's like, okay, black lives are now a little bit more at risk. And so I haven't seen those conversations brought together. But this gets back to kind of bringing that event back from it was a lone wolf in an isolated black church. I'm like, no, let's bring all these events back together. And after they're assembled, let's see if there's a pattern, and if there's a pattern, let's have that conversation. And that I think is the difference.
It's always hard in the United States to discuss systems.
Yeah.
It's always, our political heritage, whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see that very easily in this case with people focusing on the Confederate flag as like the symbol of the Charleston church, and you think about, okay, that's obviously really important and symbolizes so much that is represented in that violent episode, but at the same time, again, it's like what was the problem? Let's fix that. And it was the Confederate flag was flying in that state. So as soon as it comes down, then everything is going to be okay, right? Mm-hmm. But that said, I think that generally violence of this nature backfires, especially in the context of a contentious moment of this nature, where you have a really well-formulated, extremely talented group of people behind a powerful movement like Black Lives Matter. I mean, these are people who really know what they're doing, and so I think that in that context, the mobilization potential is extremely intense and could have really kind of widespread, longer-term impacts. I think that if we think about what was the message of the attack, a lot of people take him at his word that it was to provoke a race war or whatever, and I think that provocation is certainly one kind of intention of these types of attacks. But when we look at kind of psychological data on these things, it's just as common that it's punishment, and it's just like straight up punishment is the emotion that kind of comes trying to reestablish social control. And retaliate for seeming injury or wrong, and certainly that comes out of some of his rhetoric as well when he talks about his sort of grievances, real or fancied, against Black people. But I think that I was struck by something one of our administrators at my university was saying. We had a gathering around the Ferguson trial, and he was saying that in times like this, when these acquittals occur, that as a Black man, what it makes him feel like is that he knows his place, and that he's reminded of what his place is in society. And I think that in contentious moments, when minorities are in a committed mobilization and struggle, like Black Lives Matter, the counter-mobilization is trying to put people in their place. And that's very much, more of the social control dynamic than the provocation dynamic, I think, in this case. So a lot of attention has been given to the race war thing, and I think it's less about that and more about the kind of reestablishment of what he saw as a status between white and Black people.
Yeah, that's very clear.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think that would be very useful is, this systematic discussion of, like a lot of the stuff he mentioned was kind of like these things that are, a couple hundred years old perceptions of Black folk, but some stuff was kind of like, it didn't seem like folks would be that far off with it, right? I always found like there was public opinion poll data that showed that some people thought that there was like 25 or 30% of the population in the U.S. was Black, and I'm just like, where did they get that from? I mean, so there's a big perceptual difference between like what a percentage of the population thinks. I'm not quite sure what that percentage is, but what they think and what the reality is has real implications for how stuff like this will get read. I mean, if there's a group out there who actually believes that, okay, well, what does it mean that we're going to be the numerical minority in this society? I mean, I haven't necessarily a bunch of friends of Latino descent. I'm very happy how things are going. That said, there's a bunch of Latinos that don't like Black people either, and so I'm just like, I'm not like extremely ecstatic to try to figure out. We're not lumping them all together either. I'm just like, who's tolerant? I'm like, who's fighting for justice? I don't care what the ethnicity is, but let's figure out everybody's assessments properly, because some things are being misread in the population, and those could have very real implications. But I mean, we know enough, don't we, from like psychological arguments, that if someone feels that they're in a position about to lose everything, Right? They're not going to feel any sense of risk, right? They're going to be like, I have no other option but to start, striking out. And if these people have access to weapons and access to
Which we know they do.
The ethnic other, then the Panthers will come back. I mean, like, so it's looking at it that way.
Well, we're run up about an hour at this point, guys. So I know there were some questions. Are there any in particular that we haven't addressed that you would like to put on the table?
Well, I think a good way to end is on this question of what's next.
Yeah.
And for my own part, I can say I have no idea what people should be doing next. And I know what I want to do next, and I'll just share that we've sort of talked about this problem of feeling like, as a white person, that I don't even really know how to start talking about this conversation in a way that would be useful, or kind of understanding what my responsibility is. And so there was a wonderful set of resources that was distributed last week by Kaisha Blaine, who's a professor at, I think, Cornell, and it's called Charleston Syllabus, and it's a website that anybody can go to. And so a next step for me is that I'd like to invite anybody who wants to join a virtual book club to get together once a month and look at one of the readings together that's on the Charleston Syllabus. The information ranges from history of slavery in the United States to histories of white supremacy in the United States and abroad, as well as popular readings, and there are even readings for children and sort of resources for talking to young children and youth about our society and this problem. So I'm going to be kind of setting that up, and I guess you guys are going to be involved, and anybody else that wants to come, and we'll have some more details available for you on our respective blogs really soon on that. But that's a next step for me.
Yeah, and we'll put that also up somewhere on Conflict Consortium. I think that's a great idea. All right. Well, any parting thoughts?
I'm a big one for starting the open-ended conversation where we're not quite clear where it's going, but it definitely needs to happen. So I put this in that category.
All right, good deal. Well, I don't have a parting thought, but I want to thank you both for jumping on this, and we'll keep the conversation going, and I look forward to it.
Thanks a lot, Will, and thanks, Chris.
Okay. Very well.
Peace.
Peace.
Bye.